discussants. And I would recommend as many people as possible to join the webinars, and to also, for colleagues who aren't able to attend because of time differences or because of online logistics, to share links to the webinars after the event and to the materials. The more we share, the more people benefit from this, and it makes it much more worthwhile for our presenters to share their experiences. In a couple of weeks, we'll be announcing this year's AgriFin Annual Conference, which is going to be a very exciting conference focused on linking commercial banks in developing countries to pools of climate finance funding to facilitate farmers, smallholders, and agricultural enterprises in accessing better services and financial services. And we'll mention more of that at the end of today's discussion, and announcements will be going out in the next week or two. We think it's going to be an exceptional conference. Again, a very different topic for us, but one of such relevance to our core audience of bankers that I think it will get you all very excited and hopefully be our biggest conference to date. And again, we'll be sharing much more information, both technical and logistical, in the coming days. In addition, we have had feedback from our membership over the last few months as we've been looking at what happened last year, and we continue to get demand from our members for more technical information, more practical information that can be used, albeit to design new products, to deliver new services, to develop new delivery channels, and to ultimately expand financing to the agricultural sector in a sustainable manner. And I can assure you that we have listened to this feedback, and we've contracted authors and technical specialists and practitioners like yourself to deliver a whole series of relevant topics and papers that we'll be publishing over the coming year on our website. Again, we just want to make sure that people appreciate that we understand what you've told us you need from the network, and that we're bending over backwards to make sure that we deliver it. And on a final note, we're going to try and make things more socially interactive. We follow the kind of principles that seem to be the driving force at the moment in social networking, allowing our members to talk to each other and to talk to us in a shared and collaborative manner. So in the next few months, we'll be reaching out to you to relaunch our LinkedIn site, which is still active but hasn't had that much traction, to see if we can turn it into somewhere where we can all meet together, and when we have queries, address them and get other experts in the field able to share their experiences. However, now that we're here for the webinar, I should really start focusing on that topic. And I'd like to start by, again, reiterating why we're doing this topic. What we've realized at the World Bank Group is that climate change is potentially the biggest challenge facing all economies, whether developed or developing. And agriculture plays a very big role in both mitigating and adapting to climate change, but also as a cause of climate change. And we also know that this is growing recognition. As such, the World Bank is putting an incredible amount of resource, time, and effort into looking at climate change across all of our practices, including agriculture, and finding ways that the development community can move forward with development, but at the same time considering the impact and meeting the impact of climate change and adapting our approaches to make sure that we're finding solutions rather than creating new problems. The reason for taking this subject to a group of bankers, yourselves, those dialing in for this call, is that there is a big opportunity here for developing country banks to benefit from climate finance. There are large pools of money, primarily in developed countries, that are looking to help actors change their behaviors, to help, especially in the agricultural sector, smallholder farmers who generate greenhouse gases operate in a way that actually reduces their emissions, improves their efficiencies, and at the same time builds their capacity to earn good incomes and develop their enterprises. However, to date, and you're going to hear this from the two speakers, it's been a real challenge to find the mechanism for taking that money from the north, for want of a better word, and bringing it to farmers in the south. However, there are opportunities here, and the big opportunity that this talk today will be is about where you guys as bankers have a role to play. How can you act as the linkage between those pools of capital, those pools of liquidity, and the farmers on the ground. And I think it's an opportunity because it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the climate financiers trying to find a mechanism for reaching farmers. It's a win for the farmers getting additional capital to invest in improved production practices. And it's a big win for the financial institutions in developing countries who might be able to access better risk management tools, better liquidity at more affordable rates, subsidized capital. And this is what today's discussion is going to be about. I would also say, don't just listen to this discussion and tune out, but also have a look at the paper that these guys put together. Alberto and Tobias worked very hard to put together probably one of the leading papers in this field, thinking about how do climate finance funds link to smallholders and what is the role of banks in developing countries. And so at the end of this, you'll see in all the links on our website a way to get that document and download it. It's a leading World Bank document on the subject, and I think that you will see that it's maybe the opening salvo in a dialogue about how this can work, and something that I think as bankers you will find directly relevant. However, enough of my rambling. It's time to introduce the two presenters. The first presenter is Alberto Milan, who is an agricultural specialist with the World Bank Group. He sits in the global practice for agriculture here in Washington, D.C., and he has years of experience of working both in the UN system and in the private sector in terms of providing finance to agricultural actors. The next speaker, or maybe the first speaker actually, I'm being told, is Tobias Budaka, who's an agricultural economist here at the World Bank Group. Tobias works almost exclusively on advancing climate-smart agriculture. Climate-smart agriculture is a way, and he's going to talk about this, of developing agricultural systems in a way that actually improves the climate rather than harms the climate. And it builds resilience of farmers and of those lending to farmers. So again, he's a leading expert in this field and will be able to provide some real insight to us all. So I would like to thank those two for doing the presentation. As Tamara explained, we're going to have the presentations and then we're going to have a Q&A. Again, I beseech everyone listening, please ask your questions by typing them into the WebEx system. We'll collate the questions and ask them directly to the two panelists after they finish their presentations. Again, it's one of those rare opportunities to have two experts, global experts on a subject, available to ask questions to directly. No question is too specific, no question is too technical, and no questions are stupid. So please do ask, we'll collate them and we'll kind of ask them at the end. And again, any questions or any technology issues, please again post them to the WebEx system and we'll address them. And again, thank you all so much for joining. I think it's going to be a fantastic 2017 for agricultural finance. And now, without further ado, I pass over to the presenters, and I believe it's Tobias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. I've heard much about the AgriFin network and its unique position in the global agricultural finance space, but it's my first interaction with you. I'm not a banker, so I hope that the language that I use to describe these things will be useful and understandable to you. As Roy had mentioned, I focus almost exclusively on the linkages between climate change and agriculture, both in terms of the impact that climate change will have on agriculture and then on the impact that agriculture is having on climate change. Despite Roy's excellent introduction, you may be wondering sort of why that is relevant to you. And as Roy eloquently described, it is because we see climate change as a key opportunity for commercial lenders, because you guys are basically the best tool in the box that the international community has to address climate change in a sustainable way in the agriculture sector. And therefore, there will be increasingly climate finance resources looking to support you in your work as it benefits farmers both in terms of adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So let me first then, assuming that most of you are not experts in this topic, I'll try to first provide a little overview of those connections between agriculture and climate change. and then talk a little bit more about what this opportunity looks like. So I'm now entering the presentation that you find at the top on the right-hand side. You can see the term climate finance on top of it. If you select that, I'm now going to move to slide 2, which you can do by clicking to the one side of this little bar. And so on this slide you will find that according to our analysis at the World Bank, as well as increasingly that of a number of other players, including many private sector companies and federations, including other international organizations and many governments, we see the food system currently facing 3 very high priority challenges at the same time. I think the first one we're all quite aware of, which is that the global population is increasing massively, that we're bound to reach more than 9 billion people in 2050, but also that, thankfully, the general wealth and well-being of that population has been increasing, and therefore diets have been changing and shifting a lot of the time towards more protein-heavy diets, which require more agricultural production to be produced. Therefore, you see these in this little chart on the left-hand side that I hope you can read. You'll see these enormous increases in demand for food that we can expect running up to the year 2050, in particular in the 3 regions that are highlighted here: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East and North Africa. So this is what we need to accomplish, but at the same time we're dealing with this phenomenon of climate change that is going to alter climates all across the globe. The general trend is for higher temperatures, as well as generally more variability in the weather. And it is almost the second of these 2 that is likely to cause more problems, because as you all know very well, the agriculture sector and agricultural production is highly context specific and relies on very particular climates as we have experienced them over the past years, sometimes in very small geographic areas. And while there has always been variation, climate change is likely to add to this variation pretty significantly. And I would even say, since we've already seen about 1 degree of global warming, which is sort of a measure of the intensity of this effect or phenomenon, I could imagine that many of you already have been hearing stories from your clients where they have been complaining that the weather has been crazy, that the rains have been more erratic, have been late in coming or short-lived, etc. So what this all is currently looking like is that, as you can see here, for just as 2 examples of major cereals, maize and wheat, for a number of its major growing regions, that yields are likely to come under very significant pressure, and farmers are going to need a lot of support in dealing with this pressure, if anything, to be able to accomplish the first challenge. And then, as if this weren't already enough, it is also the case that agriculture, together with land use change, which basically describes deforestation caused by agriculture, represents 25% of the global GHG emissions. This is what you can see on the chart furthest to the right. I want you to only focus on the left-hand side of it, so where it says GHG emissions today. So 1/4 of global emissions are agriculture, which is incredibly significant. If you take the sector as if you combine this deforestation with agriculture directly, it is, after energy, the 2nd most important emission source. So many in the climate change community, when they are trying to look for opportunities to reduce emissions and bring the emissions down to more sustainable levels, are now increasingly looking to agriculture to make a contribution. And this, of course, is going to eventually entail the required financial resources to accomplish this. as well as increasingly regulation and other means to try and achieve this, but we'll focus on the finance today. So I'm now moving on to the third slide, which is just to refine a point from the previous slide, which is that in difference to sectors like energy or transport, agriculture actually is not so much a developed country problem. The largest emissions in this sector come from developing country regions, including South America, Africa, and Asia. And therefore, in the end, if you like, it is more or less your clients that are producing these emissions. And it's therefore also going to have to be your clients that are supported and enabled to reduce these emissions. Another sort of interesting point, perhaps for some of you, as you look through your portfolios and as you will be thinking later on when Alberto speaks about some of the concrete opportunities of how you may be able to tap into climate finance resources, is that really a couple of agricultural activities very much stand out in their emission contribution. And these are, for want of a better word, beef or cattle, whether it's meat or dairy. So all about cows, let's say. And then second, it's rice. Any place where rice is produced under anaerobic conditions, followed by any place where agricultural production is causing deforestation. If you focus on those three, you've covered more than 80% of agricultural emissions. So moving on now to the slide number four, sorry. So sort of what is the good news is there is an answer that's arising, a concept that is increasingly being adopted by those same players that I mentioned earlier to address these three challenges at the same time. And this concept goes under the name of climate smart agriculture. It has been promoted by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, adopted by a number of private sector players, including the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for example. And it is a key priority for us at the World Bank. We see this as an incredibly useful tool. So what characterizes climate smart agriculture is simply any agricultural intervention that yields progress over the current business as usual trend in terms of sustainably increasing productivity to feed those 9 billion people that I mentioned earlier, to enhance and build the resilience of producers against erratic weather patterns, as well as reduce emissions or the emission intensity of production. The emission intensity is a key term here because it describes it can help describe the important aspect that, as we know, agricultural production will have to increase a lot, in terms of volume. So emissions may have to go up temporarily. The key thing will be to reduce the amount of emissions resulting from the production of each kilo of meat or liter of milk, for example, produced. That is what is described with the emission intensity of agricultural production. And as we are thinking about this topic, there's a sort of a little formula that we perhaps can make it more clear for those of you who are acquainted with the term sustainable agriculture. That basically climate smart agriculture is not so new in the sense that it builds on what has been promoted as sustainable agriculture for a long time, but adding the climate change specific components of resilience and emissions. And finally, as Roy had mentioned, this topic and this concept has become a key priority for us. We're starting to invest very significant resources in a number of our client countries through major projects. And we're also producing and helping produce a number of publications and materials trying to assist development partners, governments, and the private sector to engage on climate in this agriculture space. For instance, we hosted a conference last year or 2 years ago now called resilient supply chains, where we try to bring together producers with commercial banks and agricultural agribusiness to explore how they can work better together to meet these challenges. And in the same vein, we have then also produced this paper, Making Climate Finance Work in Agriculture, but then very specifically tries to look at how we can deploy climate finance in the agriculture space, which is now what I'm going to try to focus on for now, because I imagine this is what is of most interest to you. Before we do that, just to add a sort of a layer there, while this challenge is quite daunting, over the last few years, a number of key technologies and practices, I'm not going to go here into detail, but you may want to look at what region you mostly operate in and have a look at some of the solutions that are being proposed, many of which have rather attractive business cases, and so can be seen as potentially useful tools for you to include in your lending with support from climate finance. So I'm now switching to slide 6. Because what we've seen so far is that up until now, very little climate finance has reached the agriculture space. So this is mainly because the first sector that people looked at was always energy. As you have heard, trying to switch from coal to less emission-intensive energy sources, renewable energies, etc. Maybe some of you had some exposure to the lending in this area, sort of the green energy area, and are aware of how substantively this rise of climate change has transformed lending and financial flows in the energy sector. It now looks like something similar may happen to the agriculture sector, because at the last major climate change milestone event, the Conference of the Parties that took place at the end of 2015 in Paris, where the world reached a global climate change agreement and almost all of the parties have submitted their intended contributions to this global agreement, the vast majority of these countries all mentioned agriculture, both in terms of financing needs and support needs for adaptation to climate change, as well as to reduce emissions from this sector. So you're really seeing a spread of awareness, an increase in awareness around this issue globally, and we can expect that in the future much more resources are going to flow towards the agriculture sector. And in this context, I think we can all agree that it will be very important to position commercial agricultural finance as the key channel to deliver all this liquidity, because it's the most sustainable, it's the most far-reaching, and it will likely be the one with most impact. So just a little bit more quickly, if you look at this right-hand chart, I think it's quite an interesting sort of argument, where if you look at the right-hand side, the size of that chart, that bar, the total size is the total emissions permissible by the year 2050 for the world, in order to stay within a safe zone in terms of the increase in temperature, limiting it to 2 degrees. And if agriculture and land use change, deforestation, were to continue in its business as usual, they would then make up around 70% of that total emission budget. So that's just to finalize this point that you can expect a lot of action to happen in your sector. It is no longer in any kind of faraway future, and there are quite a lot of concrete solutions and technologies out there that will be invested in. So it is an opportunity for you to position yourselves. Now, a couple of quick reasons. I'm not going to dive into in major detail because my colleague Alberto is going to talk about those a little bit further. But there are a number of different barriers that have in the past limited the ability of climate finance to enter agriculture. I'm just going to talk about a couple of specific ones that have to do with the way climate finance architecture works, which is first and foremost, a lot of the climate finance is looking for so-called carbon or direct emission benefits. So it's sort of the difference between a coal power plant producing X amount of megawatts and then switching to a renewable, say wind, and then you can, there's a clear, you can clearly calculate the difference between the two and say this has saved, X million tons of CO2, and those finance pots would then pay for this achievement. In the agriculture space, because it's much more atomized and farmers are much more fractured, it's much harder to demonstrate this kind of delta. So we'll have to work on that, but increasingly remote sensing technologies are offering much, much cheaper and much, much easier alternatives than we had available in the past. That's on the emission side, and then on the adaptation side, one of the difficulties is that it's always hard to define what exactly is furthering adaptation or building resilience versus good agricultural development in general. But there too, I think more and more a sort of a useful practical approach has arisen that asks the question, what does a specific location need to become more resilient against? What kind of weather events or weather patterns? And then tie specific measures to those topics, to those challenges. And I think with this, I'll leave you with the barriers, and I'll give my colleague Alberto the luxury of taking you into a much more positive area of solutions and innovation. And just want to say that I look forward to seeing you at our conference on this topic, which I think is going to be rather groundbreaking in bringing together the commercial lending community with the climate finance community, and where I hope we can make a lot of progress on some of those barriers and implement some of the innovations that Alberto is now going to talk about. Thank you.
Hi, Tobias. Thank you very much for that introduction, Roy and Tamara and Rebecca for organizing, and all of you for attending the webinar today. We're going to now have a quick look at what climate finance looks like, how it is being used, and basically how practitioners in the AgriFinance space can benefit from climate finance. So just to give you an idea, different studies, especially the Initiative for Smallholder Finance, has done some research and then found out that basically there is only $50 billion available for smallholder farmers and SMEs out of the $200 billion need for smallholder finance in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South and Southeast Asia. It differs from whether farmers are commercial, non-commercial, and whether they are included in tight value chains, but we can see that there is still a huge need for additional finance. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that the cost of adaptation are huge globally, and they were initially estimated between 70 billion and 100 billion a year for the period 2010 to 2050. But recent studies place these adaptation costs way higher, looking at from 140 billion to 300 billion, and from 280 billion to 500 billion by 2050. So this just gives us an idea of how the magnitude of financing needs that will be necessary in the coming years, especially in the coming decades, to combat climate change and then support smallholder farmers and SMEs to conduct their agricultural activities. When we refer to global climate finance, to give you an idea, available in 2014, there were $391 billion. This is quite a significant amount of capital that is actually available and already flowing to different sectors. So most of it comes from the private sector. $151 billion were allocated from the public sector, and they were allocated for different purposes, as we can see, adaptation and mitigation. And as Tobias already described, most of them were to mitigation. Luckily enough, the sector is changing, and most of the climate finance investors are actually or funders are actually looking at finding an equilibrium between adaptation and mitigation, and then funding 50% for each of those. Within this slide is just to give an idea, the following slide is just to give an idea of what are the key sources and intermediaries that are actually delivering finance. We can see that commercial financial institutions are nowadays playing a minor role, but climate funds already deliver in one given year only $360 million US, and then development finance institutions and government budgets, specifically development finance institutions, are playing a major role. This can be allocated once again for mitigation and adaptation purposes, and as we can see in the last chart on the right-hand side, most of the amount of capital has been allocated for multiple purposes. This includes agriculture and forestry and any kind of land use change, but specifically for agriculture, targeted as such was available $1 billion US globally. Moving on to the next slide, this is just to give you an idea of what is the climate finance architecture. We have private finance, which includes from commercial banks to private investors, impact investors, institutional investors, private foundations. Then we have multilateral public sources that come from UN agencies or non-UN agencies, and these are the so-called climate funds. Then we have bilateral public capital that comes from dedicated initiatives and donors and governments from developed countries. Then we have a critical domestic public finance that comes from national budgets, state-owned enterprises and investment vehicles, and national development banks in most of your countries. Development finance institutions, which refer in this case to those from Europe and mostly Japan and US and Canada, and then other international organizations like the UN, and regional and national funds that are available in countries that are currently recipients but are also already allocating their resources and then replenishing with funding from different investors and donors and using those resources to allocate in their respective countries. Within the next couple of slides, we are going to see exactly what might be the most interest to you. Is very briefly to give you an idea of what climate finance is doing today. Is investing on enabling environments. We've seen some questions from some of our colleagues. What are the regulations? What are the policies? So climate finance is investing on those issues. It's investing on also helping countries to mainstream climate change into policies, budgeting, and planning, on finding ways to leverage capital through blending finance from ODA with commercial finance. As an example, finding new financing mechanisms that are more innovative and that can mobilize capital at a much greater scale. Looking at innovative financial instruments, from adjusting current financial products and services that are available to designing new products like payment for ecosystem services and some others that might be beneficial for both institutions and farmers. Then looking for new delivery channels. This is where financial institutions can play a very significant role as the financial intermediaries that can connect climate finance sources to smallholder farmers and SMEs. And then looking at different metrics to measure performance and technical assistance for both lenders and borrowers. Within this slide, we can see exactly what Roy and Tobias were describing about the paper that we put together. We're going to be looking at how people working on financial institutions, commercial banks, and the like can actually benefit from climate finance. There are several ways to attract additional capital. What we are seeing nowadays being really successful are public-private partnerships between financial institutions and climate funds or private investors that have climate finance available and that are channeling that capital through financial institutions. Then development of innovative investment vehicles like layered capital structures, whereby a set of different donors and investors come together and then allocate certain capital into a fund, and according to the risk-return profile of each investor, that capital is appropriately invested in agricultural activities that take into account climate change, and the returns generated by those investments are distributed to the different investors according to their needs and the capital allocated. Then we will be looking at the different climate finance entry points into agriculture. As I described before, there are three big buckets that climate finance can really benefit commercial banks and financial institutions. One of them is by looking at the enabling environment. The other one is by looking at ways to reducing risk and improving risk management mechanisms. And the third one is by looking at different alternatives to reduce transaction costs. When we talk about enabling environment, we are referring to policy and regulations on a variety of different topics that not only affect to climate finance, but mostly to agricultural finance. So this could include systems of property rights, putting in place or improving rural credit rating agencies and bureaus, setting up collateral registries, including movable assets, encouraging mobilization of deposits, reliable contract enforcement, strong customer protection laws, and climate-smart advisory services. It's important to note that in those countries where some of these actions are already taking place or being considered for further investment, they always have to be able to prove that climate-smart outcomes are being achieved. This involves increasing productivity of farmers, but also increasing the resilience of both farmers and financial institutions to climate change and reducing emissions intensity from those agricultural activities. So as long as financial institutions can prove that those farmers and SMEs that they are lending to are improving their agricultural practices and being more protective of the climate, they are eligible for these kind of interventions. When we look at risk management mechanisms, some of the key issues that are being discussed and funded so far are rural credit rating agencies and bureaus, usage of guarantees to provide first loss guarantees or partial guarantees to incentivize private sector investment in new products, services, and even in entering into new spaces. Then insurance, different types of insurance. It can be weather-based insurance or parametric insurance. Then agricultural value chain finance, the use of warehouse receipt and warehouse financing, climate smart advisory services, and then one really important sector that is opening up is the use of big data for financial institutions to, for instance, assess creditworthiness of potential borrowers, and based on that data that has been collected and analyzed, see whether loans should be disbursed to those borrowers or not. There are some other examples that are not included in here, but there is another one worth mentioning, which is the development of credit risk management mechanisms and credit scoring systems that the several private sector firms have developed, and then they are being funded by climate funds to develop these new softwares and technologies, and then they are being implemented in partnership with financial institutions in East African countries so far. And then the third really important bucket is the mechanisms to reduce transaction costs. Some of these capital climate finance have been used to promote branchless banking and then mobile financial services as well to help financial institutions overcome some of the key barriers to lending to smallholder farmers in rural areas and so on. And finally, providing technical assistance to increase investment in agriculture. These technical assistance can be directed to both building borrower capacity, but also technical assistance to lenders, which include commercial banks and financial institutions, to better understand what are the risks that climate change poses to their portfolio and how their portfolio at risk might be affected by climate change, and how climate finance can help them by providing capital at concessional terms or market rate terms, and how they can actually use that capital to advance their portfolio of services and products. When we look at the next slide, we can see briefly what are the key financial instruments that both climate finance investors and donors are using, and financial institutions as well. So the most common ones are grants, risk coverage instruments from guarantees to some others, then concessional and market rate debt, equity, and financing of balance sheets as well. What is quite common in these cases is to see a bundling of financial instruments. So it's quite common to see that, for example, a climate investor is providing equity to a private firm, but also providing a grant to incentivize that firm by providing technical assistance or investing on trainings to promote behavioral change, let's say. And then moving on to the last slide, so we can open for questions and answers. It's just worth noting the role that the World Bank is currently playing. To give you an idea, by 2020, 28% of its current portfolio will be funded by climate finance. And this implies that the current levels of financing, a potential $29 billion a year for climate projects might be available by 2020. 100% of the agricultural lending portfolio will be climate smart by 2020. And as of now, at the end of fiscal year 2016, 50% of the agricultural projects of the World Bank were already climate smart. And we are considering that for fiscal year 16, 28% was already considered climate finance. Just to give you an idea, there are a couple of resources that might be really useful for you to get a better understanding of these presentations. One is the paper that my colleagues Roy and Tobias already expressed, the Making Climate Finance Work in Agriculture, but also a website which is called the CSA Guide. You can find the link of the presentation that can give you an idea of how climate smart agriculture works and what sources of finance might be available depending on whether you want to invest in adaptation, mitigation, or productivity. Thank you so much to all of you for attending the webinar and for your patience. Very much looking forward to hearing your questions and seeing you during the conference. That, by the way, will take place in May 2017.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much indeed to both Tobias and to Alberto for what I think was an incredibly informative set of presentations, but also more challenging to deliver that well, bearing in mind the newness of the subject, the size and scale of the subject, and the technical nature of the subject. So again, thank you both very much. However, you're not off the hook yet, because we have received a whole host of questions which we have roughly 15 minutes to cover. Now, I'm not going to be able to ask everyone's specific question, but I'm going to try and group them into pots so that we can get the overall kind of feel. Having said that, we always get to the challenge of never answering all the questions due to time. So I would like to encourage the AgriFin audience, then people on the line listening in, that if you have questions that are unanswered, please go to the AgriFin LinkedIn group that you'll find details of on our website and ask your question on there. I'm going to be asking Alberto and Tobias and the team that manage our network to start posting a few bits and pieces on there about this webinar and about the topic. And anyone who has a technical question is more than welcome to ask that question. And I promise you, and I commit to you, that we will then get proper detailed technical answers and supporting materials that you may want. Again, these guys are a great resource, but we're here to actually provide that resource to you. So don't hesitate, please do that. And of course, send in emails if you prefer to do it that way too. But without further ado, let's ask some specific questions. One question that came through from a couple of people was a specific question to Alberto. So you've mentioned that there are billions of dollars of climate finance funds out there, and that they're not being, at the moment, targeted specifically to agriculture because there's no mechanism for the climate finance funds to reach the smallholders where the activity has to take place and be financed. Well, where are these climate finance funds, Alberto? Where are they? You mentioned that there's a whole variety of them, but how do the banks approach them? What do they look like? Where do you find details of them? Any further information on that would be fantastic. And again, the same question to Tobias. So maybe Alberto?
Yeah, thank you very much, Roy, for this very important question. It is actually, we can find a couple of really good websites where there is a summary of all the different climate funds that are available. One of them is the CSA guide that is already provided in the PowerPoint presentation, and then the World Resource Institute has another website, and there are a couple of additional institutions that have put together a summary of all the different climate funds that are available, and eligibility criteria is also described in its website, so you can see whether you are based out of, let's say, West Africa, you are a financial institution, and then you are interested in lending to farmers that are focusing on increasing resilience, let's say, and then you can basically filter by those criteria and then identify what funds are available, how much money they have available, what are the eligibility criteria that you need to comply with in order to be able to access those funds. So what we can do is, through the AgriFin network, provide some of those websites where potential recipients can basically access this capital. As I mentioned, it can be not only grants, but also in concessional and market rate terms. So this might be, yeah.
Sorry, Alberto, one thing that struck me then, and again, this is a plug almost for our conference again in May, it seems to me that many of the banks who are listening in on this and many of the financiers on the call, on this webinar, will not have got experience of dealing with the climate finance funds, which are very different beasts, be they public sector, private sector, hybrid, and vice versa. Would our conference be an opportunity for them to kind of bridge that gap and to actually have some of those kind of conversations and understand the modalities for approaching?
Absolutely. That's actually the key goal and objective of the conference. The idea is to bring in together climate donors and investors from both public and private sector, and then bring together commercial banks and financial institutions from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia, and then make the connection between both of them, both these groups, so they can talk to each other and they can see basically what are the opportunities arising, how much capital is available, and how can they access and build those connections and networks.
Perfect. Now moving on quickly, because I know we're running out of time. A very good question came in from someone asking about striking a balance between addressing poverty and addressing climate issues. And I think that this one would be maybe nicely addressed by Tobias if we've still got him on the line, bearing in mind the resilience angle. Are you there, Tobias? Okay, we may have lost Tobias. You might be on mute. If you can unmute yourself.
I'm there, apologies.
Perfect.
Yes,
Thank
it
you.
is indeed an interesting question. I'm happy to answer.
Please.
So I'd like to relate it also to a couple of questions that came up around, why emissions are concentrated in developing countries. But firstly, I think the key to understand is that vulnerability to climate change is very much a function of poverty. In most systems in the north, even though they will also experience climate change impact in the agriculture sectors, they are in a position to deal with them relatively well. Let me just give you one example. In most developed countries, you have agriculture research services that are constantly improving seed material to local conditions. And so as climate change progresses and conditions change, they can iteratively, little by little, year by year, deal with these consequences and keep the seeds updated, so to speak. This kind of infrastructure is very much missing in most developed countries, as well as a large number of other reasons why developing country agriculture generally is a lot more vulnerable to climate change. Therefore, you could say pretty much anything that you would want to do to combat poverty of farmers and smallholders, or taking it from the other side, anything you would want to do to strengthen resilience is going to look very similar indeed. Therefore, between those two, I think this trade-off question most of the time doesn't really pose itself. But of course, in terms of emissions, this question is more relevant. For instance, when you look at emissions from deforestation, there's inherently a very significant sort of, you might say, climate justice question around, okay, well, these countries, say a country like DRC, they're currently, there's deforestation happening in some areas. Well, most developed countries, this same deforestation had happened a couple hundred years ago, and sort of it's already in the carbon that's in the atmosphere. Why shouldn't they also be able to do it? And this is where climate finance, including from developed countries, very much has this very important role to play in supporting them, and in part, reflecting the sort of the global public good nature of what is asked in these systems. Okay. But actually, there's a much more positive story that I wanted to quickly talk about, which is the reason that their agricultural emissions are larger in developing countries is mainly two. One is because in tropical systems, sometimes depending on the kind of, for instance, in beef production, in tropical systems you have just have a lot less efficiency because they're less productive. But then, most importantly, the key thing to look at is efficiency, production efficiency in general. Basically, almost independent of how much milk a cow produces or how fast it gains weight, it always produces the same level of emissions. Or to put it differently, if we help farmers in developing countries become more productive, we're also at the same time going to reduce the emission intensity of their production. Therefore, in many cases, good agricultural development is also climate smart agricultural development. And so rather than a trade-off, you can look at climate finance as an additional source to finance good agricultural development.
Fantastic.
That's just to try and answer this question.
Toby, that was a fantastic answer. Now I'm going to throw a question to you, Alberto, because we've had a question or a couple of questions looking at the challenge to agricultural financing when commercial banks are already struggling to make agricultural financing work as a sustainable business line. How can this really work? And I guess to dumb it down for someone like myself, the question would really be, if I'm a bank and I want to do agricultural financing to help farmers invest in technology that makes their intensification or their productivity increase so that effectively you're getting more food for the same emissions, that's great. But what does it really look like? I get money from a climate finance fund, and what would that really look like? And Alberto, this is a question for you. What would I then do with that money? How would I report back to the climate finance fund? What kind of products could I offer that currently aren't available? I mean, from my perspective, I had a long conversation the other day with someone looking at doing biodigesters to take manure out of the environment and turn people onto clean energy. For looking at this maybe from an irrigation perspective, how would a bank do this? How would a commercial bank function?
Thank you very much, Roy, for the question. Climate finance currently is available for different reasons. But then Tobias very wisely explained how these reasons, what these reasons are or these purposes. The idea is that these resources can be used to decrease the cost of capital, to reduce transaction costs, improve risk management, and at a more macro level, basically improve the enabling environment within a given country to allow financial institutions to work and lend to farmers more efficiently. The idea basically that climate finance is looking for is improvements in the resilience of farmers in greenhouse gas emissions or mitigation that we actually call and increased productivity. So those are some of these three are some of the key issues that climate funds are looking at. Not necessarily all of them. In some cases, it's just how farmers have increased productivity or how farmers have increased their resilience and so on. How financial institutions can do this is basically by using climate finance to improve the processes, improve the portfolio of products and services that they have available, and then adjust them to the needs of the borrowers, namely smallholder farmers and agricultural SMEs. So these can invest in climate smart or agricultural activities that take into account climate change, and then report to the financial institutions what the success and the outcomes have been. And then eventually financial institutions will have to report back to their investors or donors as well. It really differs from one to another situation. So it's very much context specific and then depends on the donors and the investors as well.
So again, I'm going to drive this point back to you because I'm just trying to understand it fully myself. And I think people on the call will be thinking about the different machinations that can actually come out of this. There could potentially be an opportunity where a group of smallholder farmers need to borrow money to invest over the medium term, say 3 to 5 year tenors, in drip irrigation where water scarcity is a problem. And a financial institution may have an imbalance between its short-term financing and its short-term deposits and medium-term loans. would there be an opportunity for them to reach out to a climate finance fund and secure medium-term financing to on-lend at potentially concessional rates? Is that really how this would work? But in exchange for that concessional finance and that medium-term finance, the financial institution would need to report back on the impact or to verify some of the information.
Absolutely, that is a really good question, and then we're aware of certain financial institutions that are already actually carrying out this type of business operations. So in this case, it's not a climate fund per se, it's a public-private partnership that involves impact investors in the climate finance community, then institutional investors, donors, traditional donors from developed countries, ODA, and financial institutions in Latin America. In this particular case, they are based out of Peru. And what they are doing is they are providing long-term capital at concessional terms to the financial institutions, so this can subsequently lend to farmers and SMEs that are actually investing in agricultural activities that take care of the climate and the environment, basically. As far as I know, the liquidity is lent for a 5-year period, and then additional capital is raised by the public-private partnership through the issuance of national bonds for climate change, which will be used subsequently once again to finance or to invest in the financial institution so it can keep on lending to smallholder farmers or SMEs. So definitely that is one option that is available and that is already being implemented by a couple of public-private partnerships.
Fantastic. Well, again, we're coming to, we are at the end now, but we have a lot of unanswered questions, and I don't want to just leave it at that. What I will ask everyone on the line to understand is we are going to ask Tobias and Alberto to put some additional information on our LinkedIn group. Again, come to our website to find out where that group is and how to register, and we will make sure that you get access to it and your questions are addressed if we haven't addressed them. On another note, I would very much like you to also be aware that in a week or two we have a presentation by Women's World Banking. There is a reason they are following this presentation. Many of the climate finance funds do have focus on gender issues too, and financial institutions in developing countries, some are fantastic at reaching out to female clients, but others struggle to find how they change their product sets and how they change their delivery channels to meet gender specifics. This is a great opportunity to learn from the experience of Women's World Banking and get some good ideas about product design and product delivery, which I think will be very relevant. So I encourage you to share, both attend and to share this with your colleagues who may find that relevant. And of course, I'm now going to hand over to Tamara, who's going to finalize some logistics details. I'd like to do a very big thank you to everyone who attended the webinar. I'm very sad we didn't have more time because there are some phenomenally good questions that we will migrate to the LinkedIn page or the LinkedIn group. But now over to Tamara, and thank you very much, everyone. Happy New Year. And I'm sure we'll make 2017 a very good year for moving forward in developing and promoting agricultural finance.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you to all the participants for joining our webinar today, and a big thanks to Alberto and Tobias for sharing their information and recommendations. This webinar recording and materials will be available within 24 hours on our website, agrifinfacility.org. Stay tuned for the next webinar information if you haven't already received it on the title of Reaching Women Agriculturalists in a Profitable Way. And just one final bit of information. The name of our group on LinkedIn, I've posted it within the chat box for everyone to see, but it is called the Agriculture Finance Group. So look to see you there. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.